All right, so in the last video, we talked about how these two different types of microphones work. We have dynamic microphones and condenser microphones. But in this video, we're going to explore a little bit further about why you'd want either one and what other sort of things you're going to look for and what other types of microphones you're going to choose when you're making a recording. So first, let's talk about dynamic microphones. Again, this is a pretty lo-fi technology, right? You have basically an outer shell with a big bulbous foamy windscreen on top of it, with a very thin little balloon-like membrane, a metal coil, and a magnet, and then a cable. And that's about it. Whereas the condenser microphone, we're talking about very micron-thin gold plates that are, very suspended. We'll say more likely to get damaged. You might be already see where this is going. Really, what I'm trying to get across here is that dynamic mics are, first of all, they're less expensive, so less money. There's my money symbol, and they're more durable. So guess which one of these you're going to want to put on stage in front of real musicians rocking out, especially drummers. It's not going to be this one, okay? Generally, when we're talking about live performance, we're almost always going to use dynamic mics. Now, if we are talking about, I'll say more refined performers, like if you're going to a classical music performance, or maybe Enya, or someone who is going to be a little more careful and controlled on stage, those performers will use condenser mics on stage because they will actually, here's the benefit of using condenser, have a much wider range of frequencies in general and be more sensitive and really actually pick up the sound in a much more detailed kind of way. It'll actually have a much more sense of detail. You'll feel like you're right there in front of the singer or in front of the performer when you use condenser microphones. So condenser microphones, as their attributes, they're more expensive. They're more easily damaged. So again, today's condenser microphones are still pretty hard to break, but they're still, you can drop dynamic microphones on the floor repeatedly and no one will care. If you start dropping these, you're going to probably end up having to whip out your checkbook at some point. Okay, so more easily damaged and more money, but they're more sensitive. Which also means that dynamic mics actually are less sensitive, which also means if you're putting them in front of something really, really loud, dynamic mics are often the better choice. So they can handle much louder. So I'll just say louder. But if you have something really quiet, that also makes condenser microphones the much better choice. So if you're recording or amplifying something really quiet, condenser microphones can be really good. Some people believe that if you're in a live concert situation, that you should use dynamic microphones to reduce feedback rather than condenser, but that's not really the case. Actually, they're both just as prone to feedback. That the amount of feedback really has to do with how much gain you're applying, as well as really the directional response to the microphone, which we'll talk about here in a moment. So we'll get to that. As far as these other attributes, less money, more durable, they can handle louder sounds. They also have a little bit of a dullness to their sound. We've already talked about this is more sensitive and has a lot more detail. These are slightly dulled. So sometimes you want a duller sound. Often if I'm making a recording, if there's going to be a lead singer, they're absolutely getting a condenser microphone. I'm not going to record them with a dynamic, end of story, period. But especially if I want, some sounds not to come through in the mix as well, I'll consider putting a dynamic microphone on them, especially if they're not supposed to be the lead part that the people are listening to. Maybe a couple background singers, recording with a dynamic microphone, that's okay. I'll do that. Usually I'll still want to record background singers for a condenser mic for other reasons, but it'll basically, dynamic mic recordings won't sound as forward and as front and as close to the listener as condenser microphone recordings. So more sensitive, these are very quiet. One other just thing that you have to note and be aware of when you're using these types of microphones, condenser microphones, 90% of the time require 48 volts of phantom power that is usually supplied by our microphone preamp. So make sure you have that turned on if you are using a condenser microphone. Dynamic microphones generally just don't care about phantom power, so no 48V needed. And again, this is something you need to know if you're using either of these types of microphones. Okay, so let's talk about some specifics. Dynamic microphones, basically you're going to use them in live situations. You're going to use them for drums. You might use them for other loud things like guitars. Or I specifically mean guitar amplifiers, not acoustic guitars. What else would you use one for? I guess any situation where you're worried about the microphone itself. a dynamic's going to be a good choice. Oh, sometimes brass. All right, brass can be pretty loud too, and especially if you really want a close mic brass, dynamic mics can be a good choice. So those are your main applications for dynamic mics. For condenser mics, you're going to use them mainly for, we'll say, instruments. And again, any instrument that isn't super loud and you want to capture all the detail, say lead vocals, or really any vocal part. Anytime you want to record with a large space in between your microphone and the performer, i.e., or e.g., I should say, let's say you're at a cathedral and you're recording an entire choir using a pair of condenser microphones. So whenever you want to capture something from further away or some space in between the microphone and the performer, again, that sensitivity from the condenser microphone is going to be really important to have. Basically, just about any time you want a high quality sound, or the highest quality sound, this is what you're going to use. Unless, of course, your budget can't afford it, because again, these are more expensive, and then you have to just do with what you got. Okay, but that's your basic rundown of these two types. Now, there's another way we can classify microphones, and this is completely independent of it being dynamic or condenser. And what I mean by that is, this new category is going to be on top of condenser and dynamic. It's sort of like saying, if I have a car, right, I might have a Honda Sonata, right? And that's two categories, right? The condenser is like the Honda, and the Sonata is like, well, the second category. And I can also say, well, maybe I have a Toyota Camry, right? And that's two different categories over here. Same thing with microphones. So I'm going to flip the page here, if I can remember how to do that, which I can't. Oh, there we go, down there. So the second category for microphones is going to be their directional response. And this is where does that microphone pick up sound from. And notice this is different than its sensitivity, right? In general, its sensitivity is going to be determined by it being condenser or dynamic. So directional response, I'm going to talk about really three major shapes. There are others, but here are the three big ones you need to know. The first one is called omnidirectional, and I'm writing the symbol for it, which is basically just a big circle. The second is a bidirectional, which the symbol for it usually looks like a figure 8. So I turn on my eraser. I think this is an eraser over here. There we go. There's my bidirectional symbol. And the third symbol, and this is the most popular, and you'll see why, is called cardioid. And I usually tell my students, if you can remember this, if you just look for a butt. That's a really terrible drawing of it. Let's try that again. Should we try that again? Let's erase that. I can do better. I really can't, but I'm going to try anyway. So there's that. Nope, maybe a little better. It kind of looks like a butt. But in any of these shapes, basically what this is showing you is where the microphone is sensitive to sound. So on each of these shapes, you have to picture or imagine, you help your imagination by drawing a little microphone in the front here. So here's a microphone. Omnidirectional picks up sound from all directions. Okay? A bidirectional microphone, here's my microphone, picks up sound from two directions. A cardioid microphone, and again, this is where you might want to turn off your own butt metaphor here, because I just shoved a microphone you know where. But the cardioid microphone really picks up sound from the front, and this butt is a little too wide, a little too fat of an ass, I guess. It really picks up from the front, a little bit from the sides, and really not much at all from the rear. Okay, so a cardioid is basically a directional mic. In other words, it's really recording most from over here, a little bit from the sides, and not at all from the rear. Okay, so these are three major types of microphones, and again, these can be combined with being dynamic or condenser. So what that means is, just like we could have a Toyota Camry or a Toyota Prius, if I go back over here, I can have a cardioid Omni, or I could have a cardioid Omni. I can have a condenser Omni, or I can have a condenser cardioid. Those both exist. So it's sort of like, again, specifying exactly what kind of car you want. You have to specify what kind of microphone do you want. Do you want a dynamic bidirectional, or do you want a dynamic omnidirectional, or a dynamic cardioid? See how that works? It's pretty cool. Basically, there are a few reasons why you want to use any of these types. Basically, whenever you want to record one thing, you want this one. And I'll highlight this in this pinkish red color because this is super important. And this is because this is the most common type, right? Cardioid types are it. When you want to record one thing, one vocalist, one guitar, one whatever, this one. Whenever you want to record the sound of an entire space or an entire room, you want this one. And you might ask, well, whenever you want to record exactly two things, this one, right? Well, no, don't you. If you want to record two things, use two of these. Don't use one of these. This is not going to sound the way you think it will. Bidirectional, we're going to use for something very, very different and completely unexpected. You actually have to come back for a different video because we're going to talk about how we can use microphones as a stereo, or in other words, two-channel setup. In other words, mimicking your human ear. We'll see how we can actually mimic what your ears hear using these different type of microphones, and that's when bidirectional will become more useful. So stay tuned for that. Again, the overview of today is basically you end up with 6 different types of microphones that you need to know about, that all engineers know quite well. Dynamic, and of the dynamic category, there's 3 subcategories, right? You can have dynamic omnidirectional, dynamic bidirectional, and dynamic cardioid. And then the second 3 types are condenser. In those same 3 subcategories, you can have condenser omnidirectional, condenser bidirectional, and condenser cardioid.